Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your great interest in this event, and welcome on behalf of the committee of the Christopher Dawson Centre. I hope we're a bit crowded in here. We've had a few people turned up we weren't expecting, and a few didn't turn up, so we've balanced out quite nicely. But those of you who hadn't thought about this, you could join us for dinner afterwards. There's a dinner in the next room. The booking arrangements are sloppy. That's my fault, nobody else's. I'm going to try to set the Dawson Centre up on an online booking system that will work smoothly for the future, but I haven't managed to do it yet, and I'm working on it. I think that's all the housekeeping matters. I'm sure, I haven't actually asked him, but I'm sure Mr. Sheridan will be happy to sign books.
Of course.
Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And I'd like just to record our thanks to the Hotel Soho for providing this room, which is very useful for us, and giving us a very good deal for dinner afterwards. And they've been terrific to deal with, and I'm very grateful to them. Now, our guest of honour today is Greg Sheridan, AO, born 1956, Australian Foreign Affairs journalist and commentator. He's been the foreign editor, as I'm sure you all know, of The Australian since 1992. He grew up in Sydney, Macquarie University, University of Sydney, where he's a close personal friend to Tony Abbott and to Malcolm Turnbull. Sheridan first worked at the Bulletin magazine in 1979. His reporting on the Vietnamese boat people subsequent to the end of the Vietnam War sparked a lifelong interest in Asian politics. He joined The Australian in 1984. He's worked in Beijing, Washington and Canberra before starting his tenure as foreign editor in 1992. Specialist on the Asian region and a distinguished fellow of the Australian India Institute at the University of Melbourne. So it's a great honour for us to have him here as our guest speaker, and I'd ask you to make him welcome.
Well, Archbishop Porteous, Dr. David Daintree, ladies and gentlemen, I do want to make one complaint about David's generous introduction. I always feel very uneasy when anyone calls me Mr. Sheridan, because it's normally the police, and the consequences are generally not so good. It's a bit like when someone calls you by your whole first name, Gregory. There's some trouble looming. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you tonight. What a joy, what a pleasure it is. I was speaking to the Archbishop, and I'd like to thank the Archbishop for all of his wonderful leadership in Tasmania and everything he does. But I was speaking to the Archbishop earlier and saying in this book, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, called God is Good for You, I tried to be kind of non-denominational and look at that common core of Christianity which any Christian who can assert the Apostles' Creed could sign up to. But there was one particular Catholic doctrine which I became very, very fond of and deeply attached to, which is purgatory. Purgatory is a great, great doctrine, because when you think of it, any journalist hoping for heaven is really in the position of a minor party candidate seeking to get into Parliament at a half-Senate election with some citizenship issues hanging over his head anyway. And purgatory turns it into a double dissolution, and it means that if the preferences flow just right and everything works out on the day and there's a bit of a miracle, you just might scrape in on the last place. It's the last chance saloon, really, and nobody can ever take purgatory away from me. And the reason I mention it to you tonight is because in the next half hour you may earn significant remissions in purgatory. And think, if you don't like the talk, it's done you good anyway. I'm also reminded of a similar, the American politician Adlai Stevenson found himself in a similar circumstance to mine. I'm just going to look at the phone occasionally because I don't have a watch, and I have a Fidel Castro inclination to speak for 8 or 9 hours at a time. The dinner will get cold. Adlai Stevenson, in a circumstance similar to this, remarked, for the next 30 minutes or so, or 25 minutes, it's my job to talk, it's your job to listen. if you should happen to finish your job before I finish my job, no hard feelings whatsoever. Now, I want to talk to you straightforwardly about my new book called God is Good for You, A Defence of Christianity in Troubled Times. Now, I am the foreign editor of the Australian newspaper. My life is predominantly dominated by Donald Trump and the Chinese Communist Party, and you might think anyone whose life is so afflicted would, of course, want to flee to God and religion. But I want to tell you why I wrote the book and then outline a few of its main arguments, and then happy to talk about anything and happy to talk about anyone I've ever met. If you'd like to ask about any leaders or anything, and I'll tell you Scarborough stories about them, and some of them may even be true, you never know. But one impulse for writing the book was that this is my 7th book, and with my last book I went to a lot of writers' festival, Byron Bay, Sydney Writers' Festival, Melbourne Writers' Festival, the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, wonderfully misnamed, should be called the Festival of Utter Conformity, and lots of other writers' festivals too. And I was very well received there, and everyone was very kind and so on. Mind you, I felt a bit like a wild orc brought in to a group of worried hobbits who were prepared to put up with the orc in their presence, but nonetheless had their pike staffs ready if anything went wrong. Nonetheless, everyone was very kind. But what struck me about those book festivals, those writers' festivals, there was not a single book which was pro-Christian, not one. Nor was there a single book which was pro-Jewish. So what I think it is reasonable to call the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition are not identical, but there is a long arc of continuity between them. So I think the Judeo-Christian tradition, which has underpinned everything we like in our society, was completely absent from these writers' festivals. There weren't even books really attacking Christianity. It had just been whited out of the culture. And this led me to think that part of the crisis of faith we're experiencing today is a crisis of knowledge. It's not entirely, or perhaps even mainly, a crisis of knowledge, but it's partly a crisis of knowledge. And I thought, well, one thing I could do about this was to provide a little thimbleful of knowledge to pour into the great ocean of discourse. So, and you have to admire, that's the wrong word, but you have to rejoice in how broad-minded God is to allow a journalist to talk about him. Really, it's the most wildly inappropriate mismatch. And of course, writing the book then meant sort of coming out a bit more. I've always been willing to write the odd piece about being a Catholic, but that was more or less a bit of sectarian fun. You know, it's like being an NRL Bulldogs supporter, which I am. It's loyal to your team, you know. I mean, the 3 great institutions of my life, the Catholic Church, the Bulldogs and News Corporation, you know, and I've always been faithful to all 3. But to come out, as it were, and talk about belief was a bit of a leap, a bit of a strange thing to do, and partly because there had been an old sort of secular settlement in Australia which was not meant to banish God from the public square, but was just meant to stop Catholics and Protestants from arguing all the time. And I was part of that secular settlement. I've been a journalist for 40 odd years, but I'd seen the culture become so hostile to Christianity. So when I was a kid, the culture was nominally pro-Christian. I'm not arguing on behalf of the past here. The past is a foreign country. It had its own villains and its own terrors, but the culture was at least notionally pro-Christian. Then it kind of became neutral, and now it's become decidedly anti-Christian. So I thought it would be worth saying something about it. And then, of course, as a journalist, you want to tell the truth, and you're looking for good material. And the Christian story is great material, and it's also true. So it was kind of compelling to write the book, really. So then I spent a year or so sneaking chapters of the book into the newspaper. You know, the paper has a very broad idea of what a foreign editor can be interested in. And I'm not arguing that God is foreign, but nonetheless. And then I took some time to write the book. It took three months or so actually to write the book. And that was a joy, because people would ring me up during that 3 months and say, have you heard about what Trump said about China? And I'd say to them, look, my mind is in the book of Genesis. If you have something to say to me about creation and Moses, I'm interested, otherwise go away. Trump and China will still be there when I get back, and indeed Trump and China were still there when I got back. And I just want to explain a few concerns that I had about the book, really. So the book is in two halves. The first half is an advocacy of Christianity, and the second half is a reported half about what some Australian Christians are doing today. Three themes I'll mention to you at the first part of the book, because I felt it was important to try to look at what the culture was saying to and about Christianity and assert the Christian cause as positively as I could. One theme is that belief in God is completely rational and completely sensible and completely likely. So I don't believe that you can prove God by reason alone, but obviously nor do I believe that you can disprove God by reason alone. But belief in God is completely reasonable. So belief really is more an act of the will than an act of the intellect. But your will cannot embrace a belief which your intellect regards as completely unreasonable. And the more I thought about belief, the more I realised that all of our belief is actually based on faith. So I believe that I'm the son of my late parents. I don't have any real proof of this, never did a DNA test, never in fact I think even saw any documents about it. So it's a rational belief, but the basis of belief is faith in my parents. And most of our beliefs are beliefs of faith. They're not faith in something, they're faith in someone, that person has told us the truth. And contemporary society, I think, tries to bluff Christians out of their belief by telling them that nobody believes it anymore. But when you look at the case, the rational case for God, it's kind of overwhelming. As I say, I don't think it's proven, but it's overwhelming. It's the most likely thing. It's the thing that sits easiest with reason. Roger Scruton, in his beautiful book, The Soul of the World, argues that the most convincing evidence for God is the long human experience of God. The atheists, of course, say you can't admit that experience because it's subjective. But indeed, in a court of law or anywhere else, you ask people to bring their testimony. What is their own experience? And this long human experience of God. Now, the chapter on the rationality of belief initially was a very angry chapter denouncing the new atheists. And I realised that's a great mistake to approach. Well, you know, I had a lot of help coming to this realisation. That is to say, some of my friends said, "You can't write that, mate. No. Cut it out. You've got to approach the thing altogether differently." And I realised it's most important to make the positive case for God. And you know, there are a million intuitions of God in the universe. The universe demands explanation, but it doesn't really offer explanation. But in order to do this chapter, I read through the new atheists, and I'd never had any interest to read them previously, but I thought I should conscientiously read them for this. So I read Dawkins and Hitchens and the others, and I was astonished at what utter feeble rubbish it all was. I couldn't believe what junk it was, really. And I realised they're not actually mounting a rational case. They're acting really like 19th century Anglican bishops. They're just telling the faithful that their belief is kosher, that it's okay, that it's orthodox, that it's approved. And mostly their arguments are the old antique 19th century arguments sat next to a whole lot of completely irrelevant science. So Dawkins goes on at great length about how old the universe is. It's 14 billion years old, and adduces that as an argument against God, as though God couldn't have spent 14 billion years creating a lovely garden for us. It seems, I admit, it's more generous than Dawkins would have been. It's more generous than I would have been, probably. I might have created a garden for us in 7 days or something, but apparently God took 14 billion years. But that, when you think about it, is completely characteristic of God. And then when you investigate life, it is astoundingly unlikely. It's like winning a 1 in a billion lottery every day for 100 years to produce human beings. Still, a life in journalism teaches you that things which are unlikely often happen. Indeed, every political career is a miracle of unlikeliness, really. So it's not a proof of God, but it's an indication of God. And then you ask, how do the new atheists cope with this unlikeliness of life? They cope by leaps of faith, by magical thinking. They create an infinite number of universes. They just say, well, actually there's an infinite number of universes and we just lucked into the one that is good for life. Where did this infinite number of universes come from? There's not the slightest bit of evidence for it. It's just a statement of faith. So atheism is really a religious faith, but one that is full of really wacky magical thinking, great leaps of faith, and no basis for this faith. So I found that it was reassuring to have read them because they were so feeble, but I don't think the right way to react to them is just to denounce them, because the only people who read that are people who've already read the New Atheists and would like to know why they're wrong in some detail. Whereas I think our job is simply to spread the message that belief in God is the natural human condition. The second theme in the first part of the book is the debt we owe in our civic culture to Christianity. I was greatly influenced by a superb book by an Oxford scholar, Larry Sittentop, Inventing the Individual. I don't think Sittentop is a believing Christian. I don't know. I'm going to meet him in London in a month or so. But I don't think he's a believing Christian. He's just a wonderful scholar. And he traces, in a sense, the civic development of Christianity from before Christianity through to the end of the Middle Ages. And he argues that everything we like in modern liberalism came directly from Christianity. It didn't come from a rejection of Christianity. So there's a Disneyland view of church history which goes something like this. Jesus was a nice bloke, good social worker, the kind of Mahatma Gandhi of his time, would have supported paid maternity leave if it had been available in the Palestinian jurisdiction of the Roman Empire at that time, was persecuted by wicked state authorities. His early followers tried to live like him and were persecuted. Then in the 4th century along came Emperor Constantine, turned Christianity into the state religion of the Roman Empire, and then you got the Dark Ages and 1,000 years of superstitious Savonarola-like rule by wicked priests. Nothing good happened for 1,000 years. Then happily we got the Renaissance, when everybody started eating smashed avocado and going to art galleries, looking at nude statues and being a bit liberated. Then you got the Reformation, which was a further rejection of Christian superstition. Then you got the Enlightenment. Humanity turned its back on God, and everything has been perfectly happy ever since. Obviously, you might think, well, one or two other little captious things happened, World War I, World War II, Nazism, communism, but basically everything has been happy since the rest got rid of God. And as Siddentop shows, although he speaks in much more elevated terms than I do, of course, every element of that Disneyland view of history is in fact the reverse of the truth. So the most radical pro-human rights statement in the ancient world is in the book of Genesis. God created mankind in the image of God. Nobody had ever conceived an elevated and magnificent idea of human nature like that before. Then with Christianity comes the radical universalism of the Gospels. There is no longer Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free nor man nor woman, but you're all one in Christ Jesus. The idea that slaves are human beings with immortal souls. Revolutionary idea that marriage is an institution of reciprocal love and obligation. Revolutionary idea that fathers don't own their children, that all human beings have dignity arising from their immortal relationship with an immortal and omnipotent God. These were revolutionary ideas. Took a long time for Christians to work them all out in their implications. There were Christian voices from very early on denouncing slavery, but there were also Christians who practiced slavery. Of course, throughout history, Christians have done lots of bad things. If that's your only argument against Christianity, you'll have an easy argument. But, of course, in my view, Christians have done overwhelmingly more good things than bad things. But that's not the point about our development of civic culture. Siddentop traces how particular Christian movements led directly to what we now think of as our civic culture. The concern for the poor became an object of state policy for the first time because of the Christian concern for the poor. And the bishops programs of welfare. The monastic movement of Saint Benedict in what was it, the 6th century, was very radical because it was radically egalitarian. When you joined a Benedictine monastery, it didn't matter whether you'd been a nobleman, a freeman or a slave. You wore exactly the same habit, you possessed no property, and you were completely equal. Not only that, the monasteries were the first democratic community in human history because all the monks elected their abbot. And not only that, the monks were leading what the church regarded as the holiest lives available to human beings, and yet they were working, doing hard manual work every day on the farm, whereas hierarchical societies, and especially slave societies, had always regarded work as a menial and degrading thing to be done preferably by slaves, not to be done by free men, not to be done by men or women at the top of the social hierarchy. Siddentop explores how the long dialogue between the church and the state over what was the province of the church and what was the province of the state, what was the difference between a crime and a sin, how civil law could not enforce every element of moral law, how there was a wide discretion for human conscience. These were all ideas developed thoroughly by the Middle Ages or by the latter part of the Middle Ages. And Siddentop argues that by the latter part of the Middle Ages, everything you need for modern liberalism, the idea of the individual, the idea of human rights and individual dignity, the idea of representative government, had been developed in Christianity. He also shows, I think I rely on another historian for this, Rodney Stark. Experimental science grew up in Western civilization and in no other civilization, directly as a result of Christian doctrine. So the idea was that God was rational and ordered, that's a clumsy way of putting it, and his creation was rational and ordered. So if you looked in creation for a sign of his order, you were discovering the order of creation, you were discovering an element of the divine order. But at the same time, the natural world was not full of capricious spirits. There were no polytheistic gods, there were no wood sprites and fairies and so on. Now I say this as a superstitious Irishman, of course. We believe behind every babbling brook there's a malicious leprechaun, but classical Christianity did not believe this, and so it investigated the natural world and it falsified its propositions, tested its propositions, discovered God's order, and through this experimental science was developed. There were huge technological advances in the Middle Ages, and the superiority, the technical superiority of Western civilization was established then. Now it's quite clear Western civilization, and even more so Christianity, are universal ideals. They are creedal. You can join up just by believing, not by ethnicity or ancestry or anything like that. Nonetheless, the civilization which Christianity shaped was Western civilization, and Western civilization was unique because of its conceptions of human rights and science and so on. Now in the Renaissance, in the Reformation and in the Enlightenment, these ideals were not rejected, they were developed and debated. And the great figures of the Enlightenment were generally believing Christians. Some of the great propagandists of the Enlightenment, of course, were terrific anti-Christian polemicists, basically journalists who, of course, never do anything productive, but come up with great slogans like the Dark Ages. You know, what a terrific two-word slogan to demonise 1,000 years for the next 500 years. And finally, Siddentop argues that it is quite wrong to associate liberalism with a rediscovery of classical civilizations. Certainly, there was an artistic rediscovery of Greece and Rome and a rediscovery of ancient Greek philosophy, but modern liberalism depended entirely on Christian moral categories which did not exist in the ancient world. When the Greek philosopher said man is the measure of everything, he didn't mean women, he didn't mean younger sons, he didn't mean slaves, and he didn't mean foreigners. He only meant Greek property-owning heads of households. The universalism came with Christianity. And then the final theme of the first half of the book, which I'll just mention in a word, was the fun I had reading the Old Testament for the first time. Now, I hope I don't scandalise the Archbishop and he'll forgive me for this next remark, but like a lot of Catholics, I hadn't read much of the Old Testament, not necessarily that much of the New Testament really, but certainly not much of the Old Testament. And I really felt I had to read it properly, as well as hearing the readings at Mass on Sundays. So I didn't read it cover to cover, but I went into particular books that I found recommended. And what fun it is, and what a shocking act of wicked vandalism it is to prevent our school kids from having access to it. Book of Jonah. This is one of the great rollicking comedies of all time. This is a Mel Brooks story. I tell you what, they were great journalists who wrote the Old Testament. They were written more in the style of, I live in Melbourne, more in the style of the Herald Sun really than the Australian. The Old Testament had great sub-editors. They always named the names, short sentences, got to the point, short stories. Jonah is like a journalist. God is his editor-in-chief, sends him out on an assignment to convert Nineveh. Jonah doesn't want to do that, so like a good journalist, he goes on a cruise instead, you know. God says, no, can't do that, cuts off his expenses, flings him inside a whale for a few days. Very unpleasant for Jonah. So Jonah finally goes off to Nineveh, preaches to the Ninevites, and he's very much like the musical producers in Mel Brooks' comedy, The Producers. He doesn't want what he's singing to succeed in Nineveh. And instead all the Ninevites listen to him and convert, and he's so unhappy. They repent rather of their wicked licentiousness, and he's so unhappy. He goes into a terrific sulk for the rest of the book, and God says, you did a good job, Jonah. And Jonah says, oh, Yvette, don't talk to me about that. Look at these Ninevites now, they've all repented. Now you're not going to punish them. I knew this would happen, isn't this, Jonah? And Jonah moans and whinges, very much like a journalist, I must tell you, coming back from assignment. And but of course, within the comedy, there's a magnificent message, which is that even in the Old Testament, God is universal. God is the God of the Ninevites as much as the God of the Israelites. And all through the Old Testament, despite the defamation of the Old Testament for being allegedly violent and narrow and sectarian, the call to the universalism of God is a constant theme, not a constant theme, but a repeated theme throughout the Old Testament. I fell in love with the Book of Ruth, which is the most magnificent short story in human literature. I found myself enthralled by the Book of Job, which is surely the greatest meditation on innocent suffering in the entire history of human contemplation. And once you start investigating the Book of Job, it's endless. There are so many magnificent essays on Job. Chesterton wrote a wonderful essay on Job. The Jewish former chief rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, whose books were tremendously helpful to me, wrote wonderfully about Job. There's a beautiful episode in Job where he can't understand why he's suffered, and he wants an audience with God, and he goes to God and finally has an audience, and God sort of says to him, okay, what have you got to say for yourself? And he says, well, how can I say anything? I'm small. And that Job is there speaking on behalf of the whole human condition, really. And the authors of the Book of Job don't provide him with a neat formula to sum up the reason for his innocent suffering. There isn't an easy answer, and instead God reminds him of the majesty of creation. And you're left still with something of a mystery, and yet you're also left with this consolation, that throughout the book of Job, Job never loses faith in God, and God never loses faith in Job. And I found the Jewish commentators on Job tremendously interesting. Christian commentators, quite rightly, are reading the New Testament, reading the Old Testament, always looking for the New Testament, quite rightly. Jewish commentators are kind of reading it for its own sake, which is a lot of fun. So then, just to give you 2 minutes on the second half of the book, the second half of the book then is a reported part. And partly because I thought it would get some publicity, I decided to interview a lot of politicians about their Christian beliefs. I knew them slightly, some of them, and some of them very well, and I knew that they had Christian beliefs, and I wanted them to sort of come out and talk about it. So I ended up interviewing 14 former and serving politicians: Malcolm Turnbull, Bill Shorten, Tony Abbott, John Howard, Peter Khalil, Mary Eason, who's no longer a politician, Michael Tate here in Tasmania, who's no longer a politician, and some others, Peter Costello, and all of them really were reluctant to do it. And it wasn't that they were cowardly, it was that they were very modest. They were aware of the shortcomings in their own life, and I must say that's another reason it's a huge hurdle to come out as a Christian, partly because you realise what a rackety, unsatisfactory life you've led, and you think, well, you don't want anyone to judge Christianity by my life, for goodness sake. But then you realise if you leave the discussion only to the morally qualified, it'll be quite a small discussion. And in any event, it's really a cowardly excuse for not speaking. So all of these politicians said to me, look, it's a good idea, Greg, I'd love to help you, but I don't want to do it. And I talked them all into it in the end. I harangued them, cajoled them, blackmailed them, harassed them, tricked them, did everything I could. Finally gave them false deadlines so that they could get back to me and say, oh mate, I'm so sorry, I missed your deadline. And I could say, don't worry, I'll extend it for you. And they all rewarded me really with they were cautious in what they said, but there was a certain richness in the inner life and a deep knowledge. Lots of them made theological mistakes, that's okay. But there was a deep knowledge about Christianity in all of them. And part of the subtext of that section was simply to say to the wider audience, look, it can't be that stupid if these brilliant people who have run our nation all believe in it. Lots of politicians, of course, are not believing Christians, and I'm not critical of them, but I was exploring the ones who are. And I didn't want to ask them, the only time anyone asks a politician about their religious belief is to ask them, what effect did your religious belief have on your policies? I was absolutely uninterested in that. They all came prepared with lots of quotes, sewerage works, in the western suburbs are a direct result of social justice teachings, which are a direct result. Wasn't interested in any of that. If anybody said any of that, didn't make it into the book. But mostly they didn't say it because that wasn't the question I was asking. The question I was asking was, what do you actually believe? Do you believe in God? Do you believe in an afterlife? Do you pray? Are you going to be accountable for life? Will you be judged? Do you believe in heaven and hell? Do you believe in the last things? And people had varying degrees of reluctance in answering those questions, and yet the answers overall were quite beautiful, and in my opinion. And I'm not being remotely partisan, but there was they were all very rewarding. Bill Shorten, to give you one person, there's no politics in this comment at all. But I was asking him if atheism had ever appealed to him, and he said, I understand all the scientific arguments, but I look at my youngest daughter and I just see the beauty in her, and I can see that there's something transcendent here, that there's something beyond science. And I thought, Bill, that's very wise. That's a wise statement. That's a true statement. And all of them really rewarded me in that way. And then the rest of the second half of the book is looking for signs of new life in Christianity. So in the West, there is a big decline in Christianity, there's no doubt. It's not happening anywhere else in the world, but it is happening in Western Europe, North America, and Australia and New Zealand. In other parts of the world, Christianity is on fire. It's the one social force the Chinese government cannot control. It's on fire in Africa. It's full of life in Latin America. But in the West, it's in decline. But the decline is not unrelieved by fabulous signs of new life all over the place. In our own church, there are these new ecclesial movements. I only really explore one of them, Focolare, which is Italian for fireside, which is just really a group of predominantly lay people trying to live according to the gospel. And they're a very interesting movement because it's in their constitution, approved by, I think it was Pope John Paul II, that they would always be led by a woman. So they have priests in their group, and they have men and women in their group, but they are emphasising the Marian profile as opposed to the Petrine profile of the church. They're doing this with the full support of the church. They're a fascinating group. There are millions and millions of members all over the world. I looked at the magnificent Campion College in Sydney's West. No government support, not really that much church support in the early days, and a liberal arts college just based on the great books and the Catholic tradition, which just arose out of the earth, really out of nothing, and now has produced hundreds of graduates. Now that's not hundreds of thousands of graduates, but hundreds of graduates is a lot better than no graduates at all. I interviewed a new Benedictine monastery here in Tasmania, which was attracting brilliant young men to give their lives to contemplative prayer. And then beyond the Catholic Church, I made great friends in other denominations. Met evangelical parishes involved in parish planting in Perth, became terrifically good friends with the Pentecostals. My taste in church music tends more to Gregorian chant than rock and roll, but if you like rock and roll, the Pentecostals do it in a very Christian way. And what I like about them is that they're absolutely unabashed and unashamed and joyous and straightforward and unembarrassed about their Christian beliefs. And I think there is developing an informal alliance between, I don't remotely speak on behalf of the Church and I blush in the Archbishop's presence, but I think there is a sort of a de facto informal alliance emerging amongst all the Orthodox Christians, the Catholics, the Evangelicals and the Pentecostals. And I think that's a terrifically propitious development. Finally then, I have a chapter at the end trying to suggest a few ways forward. And having met a lot of different Christian groups across Australia, the things that I saw that lead to success are in a religious movement are strong and clear leadership, strong and clear beliefs, not wishy-washy beliefs, but so the content of the belief might be wishy-washy, but it has to be clear. Or I'm expressing this very badly, but you have to know what you believe in, and you have to believe in what you believe in and not believe in its contradiction. You can't be on the black side and the white side at the same time. If you're a Bulldog supporter like I am, you can't be a St George supporter, and of course who would want to be? But so leadership, clear beliefs, and then the third thing is a form of worship which has an aesthetic beauty and attractiveness to it, which echoes the aesthetic beauty of the religious message itself. Now, I hope the beloved Benedictine monks don't get upset when they actually read the book. I visited them again today and they very sensibly haven't read the book so far, but I put them in a chapter with the Pentecostals because both the Pentecostals and the contemplative monks have a very experiential approach to religion and a very, very direct approach to their interaction with God. Anyway, I apologise if that's too heretical. I did get some wonderful letters from clergymen of all denominations afterwards. I tried to get that consensus, that Mere Christianity consensus, but I actually let quite a lot of specifically Catholic things slip through, which I didn't know only we Catholics believe, such as that Mary led a sinless life and so on. So I got a lot of letters after the book was published saying, from very kind clerics and others saying, "Dear Greg, well done, good on you, you had a good shot at this book, you're doing a good job for a journalist. Quite a lot of good stuff in that book, but my goodness me, on page 178, you just made another terrible blunder." And then lots of these letters contradicted each other, but which showed that I hadn't quite got the consensus just right, but in any event, it was an honest effort. So finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just say that although we are in a difficult time for Christianity in the West, we're not being persecuted like Christians are in many parts of the world, so we shouldn't exaggerate our own difficulties. A difficult time also gives you what my friends in the Air Force would call a target-rich environment, and I do argue in the book that we should conceive of ourselves as a bold minority. Being in the minority gives you quite a lot of psychological and operational advantages, and given that we are now in the minority, we may as well, another military metaphor, you need good situational awareness if you're going to prevail on the battlefield. Situational awareness is a term of art in military life, which means the ability to integrate a wide range of information from many different sources in real time so that you can act with strategic effect on the battlefield. And if you have superior situational awareness to your adversary, it's more likely than not that you'll prevail, unless the correlation of forces is too heavily against you. And my absolutely final thought is that we must respond in the spirit of the Irish. Situation desperate, advance on all fronts. Thanks very much. Thanks.
That was a wonderful talk. Now I'm sure there are questions and comments, and can we throw this open for a while? Yes, please.
It's a comment. I'm a Bible student of some time, and the title of your book is God is Good for You, which I totally agree with you on. But every argument it seems you put forward is based on what man thinks, and I'm not opposed to what man thinks at all, because I have thoughts and ideas about God as well. But you don't go to the Bible to prove, the scriptures to prove God is good. And, man's thinking about God, you could say, Christianity is in decline. Is man's thinking believable to a non-Christian thinking about becoming a Christian? Probably not. I'm not saying it's not worth listening to, but maybe if you went to the scriptures a little more, which is a higher thinking, it's God's word, it's all God's word, that seems to shift people's listening, is my experience. Do you know that I can say what I say, but whenever people listen, if I'm speaking to them about Christianity or God, when I get through to them is when whatever I say, I will back it up with the scripture. And they will say, I have never seen that in the Bible before. So suddenly they're listening to God's word and not to me. So it's just a thought. It may have been more, maybe there is more in there, and it could be, I don't know, but I didn't hear you speaking on it.
Look, that's a very profound and sound point. And if you find that there's anything lacking and inadequate in the book, you are certainly right. I'd like to blame my advisors if I possibly could. But I'd just make a couple of points really. I really understand what you're saying and I really agree with you. So the lack of a Bible focus I was aware of myself, which is why I devoted one chapter entirely to the Old Testament. But also in the chapter about the rationality of God, there's a great deal of the Bible. In the chapter about the civic development of Christianity, there's a great deal of scripture, and in the chapter about what Christians believe, there's a great deal of the New Testament. Now, I still think it's a fair point, and another reviewer made it in a different way. He said you didn't really write about the Gospels in a lively enough way. That's absolutely right, and I'd plead guilty to that, and all I can say is the challenge, therefore, is for someone in this room to write an even better book. But I take your point. I benefit very much from your input, and thank you very much indeed.
Nick, please. Yeah.
Greg, just quickly, it's a very big topic, but we seem to be in a situation where the arts, the media, and this education system have been sort of taken over by cultural Marxism maybe, or something that denigrates our own formative culture, is prepared to acknowledge and look to any other spirituality except the Christian one. I just wonder, how did we get to this point? I mean, how did the education system, which in a sense is really a Christian invention, wind up in this country and in the West in really spreading an ignorance and a distaste for its own cultural roots?
Look, it's a very profound question indeed. I'm just going to make 2 points in reference to it, which, is not to answer it properly because otherwise I'd go into Fidel Castro mode and we'd be here forever. One point is, I think one of the failures of conservatives of my generation was that we're appalled, we are rightly appalled at what has happened, rightly appalled. And when it began to happen, we kind of circled the wagons and defended our territory. And that was the right thing to do, and it was a sensible thing to do, and it was well motivated, it was good in spirit. But it's the least attractive way to recruit anyone to your cause. If you are saying, I'm going to get in the ring and punch the lights out of this guy, that's a very healthy instinct. And it's an instinct we in journalism encourage a lot, and it's a political instinct, and it's not always wrong. But unless you're already in the fight, it's not attractive. So you don't get any new recruits that way. So you almost are conceding that your opponents have won and will win, because while you're busy boxing on with them, you're not actually going out recruiting the new folks to your positive. Now, this is not an argument for never boxing on with your opponents. I think, I've had a life of mortal combat with ideas, although in the context of this book, I decided to go another way, to try to put the positive truth rather than why our opponents are so bad. But so that doesn't answer your question. To answer your question really is a huge undertaking, but just to offer you this thought, how did we get to this point? There is a tremendous, fascinating argument to be had about why we have secularised, why we have lost belief in the West. And there are two broad schools. There's the historic school, which can cite, developments going back hundreds of years, and certainly the Reformation, the wars of Christians after the Reformation, which to some extent discredited Christians, and Christians did behave very badly when they tried to impose their orthodoxies on each other. The two world wars of the 20th century, the false idea that we once had that every new development in biological science was a challenge to Christian belief, and so on, the misunderstanding of the magisterium of science and the magisterium of religious belief and so forth. And a million things like that. The atheist philosophers, David Hume and Nietzsche and so forth. Marx, of course, the first great mass atheist philosophy, Marxism. But then, so that's the historical school, of which there are many variants. But then there is another very interesting school, which says actually, even up to the 1950s, the vast majority of people were believers and practiced too. Now, that can be contested. There's a fascinating essay by Joseph Ratzinger, long before he became Pope, going right back to the 1950s, which talks about the development of a pagan Europe, by which he meant a Europe which didn't believe in the sacramental realities any longer. But nonetheless, up to the 40s and 50s, people went to church, they got married once, they fought for their countries if they were required, they gave their lives in a cause. There's only so much you can ask of a human being before you say, but you're only really joking, you're not serious in your commitment. And then all of a sudden, it was gone. And that school of thinking says really it was the sexual revolution and mass media were the two great, and then the sudden drop in family size, the lack of warmth in family life, the need for two incomes always, and no one in the world would be against, women working if they want to and all the rest of it. But a two-income household is a different family environment from a household where mum is there always with the kids. And there is that interesting school, which is that secularism was actually very, very sudden. And then the philosophical madness just sweeps into the vacuum. So the historic school says the philosophical madness produces the secularism. The sort of it all happened in a minute school says the madness of the 1960s invites the philosophical crazies to come in and occupy a vacuum. And I'm agnostic. But it's one of the few things on which I don't have a settled, determined opinion. And that's even more remarkable because I don't know, and normally if a journalist doesn't know, he has an even stronger opinion.
Yeah, gentleman here.
Thanks. Thank you, Greg. Two quick things. I first heard you talk about your book with John Anderson on his podcast.
Oh, right.
I really have enjoyed listening to the podcast. And it made me think about, you said you were going to meet Sid Top, was it? Is that being recorded at all, that conversation, or is that a private?
No, that's a private conversation.
Right, okay.
What was the other thing?
The other thing was, I'm one of these wishy-washy Catholics in terms from a Catholic family, still working it out. But the biggest influence on me has been René Girard. I don't know if you're familiar
the
with
biblical
René
scholar,
Girard.
yeah.
And whether I read a quote recently from David Bentley Hart, who's another Orthodox theologian, who referenced René Girard, saying he was one of the most important New Testament scholars of our time, and I wonder if he made any mention in your book, and if you're aware of him. And
Sure. Well, let me also give you another thought on Larry Siddentop. I didn't really seek to meet Larry Siddentop. A friend of mine who lives in London read my book and said, "Oh, my old friend Larry, you're quoting my old friend Larry. That's great, I'll send him a copy of the Bible." I said, don't do that. I borrowed so much from him, but I did acknowledge it all, but also he might not like the conclusions I came to. And I was in absolute trepidation, and I kept trying to send these emails to my friends saying, "Oh, John, that's fantastic, don't bother him, I'm sure he's but anyway, he read the book. I don't want to verbal him, but according to my friend, he's quite happy with the book, and he's agreed to have lunch with me. So I'm incredibly nervous about that, really. And but he's, in a scholarly way and in an authorial way, he's a hero of mine. I think his book, Inventing the Individual, The Birth of Modern Liberalism, is the most sweeping and majestic and compelling book of history that I've ever read in my life. Now, the biblical scholar you mentioned, I know a bit. I'm not a biblical scholar, so I shouldn't really make any proper comment. I read a lot of essays on the scripture, but these matters are accessible to lay people. I think they are open to endless intellectual inquiry, and that's a good thing. There is a bit of a problem in over-intellectualising it. There's a wonderful essay, which I hadn't read for my book, but I quoted in a newspaper recently, by Benedict again before he became Pope, the Erasmus Lecture on biblical scholarship, and it is screamingly funny. Benedict had a wicked sense of humour, and he talks about biblical scholarship, and he says, look, first we investigate the context. He phrases it much better than me, but he says, first we investigate the historical context, and then we find the bits of the New Testament that we think are consistent with the historical context, and then we find the bits of the Gospels which are the same across all the Gospels, so then we decide that those bits must be authentic, and they therefore come from an earlier source, which of course we have no idea about, and then we decide that only the earlier source is authentic and everything else is an accretion, and then we wonder what the earlier source came from. And he's too polite to say this, but he said, in effect, 99% of biblical scholarship is just rubbish, really. And when you think about it, most literary criticism is complete junk. If you go to a modern university and enrol in an English literature course, you are going to get a plenary indulgence in purgatory, because they will take the most majestic works of literature that humanity has ever produced, and they will infuse them with the most idiotic, insane interpretations which have nothing to do with actually reading Shakespeare or reading Jane Austen. They'll try to tell you that, Jane Austen was an unconscious purveyor of the forces of patriarchy and heteronormativity and what have you in her era, therefore Mr. Darcy has to be seen as a symbol, blah, blah, yakety yak. And you think, well, who and why would you ever bother reading Jane Austen if you had to go through that rubbish? And wouldn't you just be better off reading Jane Austen, So I have this revolutionary idea. Of course, I'm an Orthodox Catholic, and of course I think our reading of Scripture is subject to church interpretation and guidance and so on. I'm happy for the church to do that. That's above my pay grade. But the most important thing is actually to read the Gospels and the Epistles and the Old Testament themselves, really, rather than... Then there are all these splendid essays. I mean, as I say, on the Old Testament, I find Jonathan Sacks absolutely magnificent. But I found on Job, Sheridan, magnificent. On the New Testament, there are loads and loads of people who I'd recommend. I'm aware of Girard. I've read a few of his essays. I don't know enough to make a more sensible comment than that.
Yes, please.
Well, it was kind of a comment mixed with a recommendation. You mentioned that you'd looked at some of the new atheists, and to make a generalised statement, I'd say they're pretty bad at what they do. And so I thought that perhaps looking at some of the older atheists who tend to make a better case for themselves, a recommendation would be Mikhail Bakunin. It's a book, The Godless State. It's about 4 hours long. It's not too bad, but I'd argue that it's far better than most of the new atheists. And obviously, you're an intellectual individual. I assume you'll have some fun with it. So I thought I'd.
Look, thanks for the recommendation.
Just in case people can't hear, what was the name again? Bakunin, wasn't it?
Mikhail Bakunin.
Mikhail Bakunin.
And what's the name of the book?
The God and the State.
Yeah.
The God and the State. Yeah.
Sorry,
So
Greg.
look, that's a wonderful recommendation. But you know, I've only got a certain. You measure your life in coffee cups. Was that what Larkin said, or was it Eliot? You know, I measure my life in coffee cups. I've only got a certain amount of coffee cups left. I actually think I've read enough atheists, really. I mean, I'm not scared of reading them. I don't mind. I read a lot of them when I first read Chesterton and C.S. Lewis and Malcolm Muggeridge and so on. I read loads and loads and loads of atheists at that time, Sartre and Camus. Dear Lord, I read Sartre in French. That will get you a plenary indulgence as well, you know. I mean, the book was called Nausea, and it fully lived up to its title. You know. It was even more nauseous in French than it is in English. And then for a long time I didn't read them, because why would you? And then in order to write this book, I read them because they were the vogue, you know, and then I saw what rubbish they were. Now, I'm not scared of reading them. It's an interesting argument. I had a debate the other night with Bob Carr at the Australian Catholic University about God. Does God exist? Bob is a superb, thoughtful, skeptic come atheist. We had a very nice encounter. Very happy to do that. But you know, there are only so many books left in my life to read. I'm not absolutely sure that I'm going to put some more atheist books right up the top. But for people who are interested in that sort of stuff, I'm sure they're better than the new atheists. They could hardly be worse.
Time for another. Yeah, please, Ron.
Greg, you work in the media. That must be very dynamic in terms of you are what you are, and you don't pretend to be otherwise. But I'm sure a lot of your colleagues and peers have a totally different view of the world. Does that raise its head at all in your work environment? Do you get challenged by some of your peers at times?
Not really, not really. I think if you make a political defence of the church, you'll get challenged more, but not by your peers so much, but just, you know, on the ABC and so on. There's been a little bit of hostility to the book online and here and there. But on the whole, I think I was very well treated by the ABC. I was saying to David earlier, the best interview that I did on the book, really by miles, was with Richard Glover, the drive time ABC announcer in Sydney. And I wrote a little article about it later, complaining, saying this was a very big problem, this interview, because the questions were so much cleverer than the answers, you know, and he'd really read the book conscientiously, thought deeply about it. His wife or his partner had been unhappy that he was spending so much time on the book. She thought he might pope or convert or something, and we had a wonderful discussion for half an hour on the air, and he said, you know, you almost had me at page 178 or something, and I said, gosh, what was that? Not remembering what was on that page. And he said it was the point where you argued about the incredible statistical unlikeliness of life in our universe, and indeed of the universe altogether. You know, life is dependent on carbon. Carbon developed in such an eccentric way. If the Big Bang had been a little bit stronger, all the gases would have dissipated, we'd have had no planets. If it had been a little bit weaker, everything would have fallen back into the black. It had to be just right, you know. And it was a wonderful discussion, and a certain portion of his listenership was upset about it. And they abused him and said, why are you broadcasting this Christian propaganda? Now, he is a terrific fellow, Richard Glover, and the next day he sort of made his own editorial on air, and he said to his listeners, or to that portion of them, he scolded them, and he said, why are you so narrow-minded? He said, no one could accuse the ABC of proselytising for Christianity. That is just ridiculous. He said, I do one pro-Christian interview about a book that I found terrifically enjoyable, he was generous enough to say. You narrow-minded bigots, he said, why don't you go out and read the book instead of condemning it without reading it? So how generous and how good that was on his part. Now, the final thought about my colleagues. Journalism is a very diverse profession. It's a wonderful profession, I love it. It's a great life. One day though, if I am on the outskirts of the pearly gates, someone will say to me, so you had all this fun and people paid you for it and you claim that was work, you know, and this will be quite hard to justify. But one of the paradoxes of journalism is that, let me offer one other reflection before I conclude. In the book, I found a number of politicians who had given their life to public service and at the end of a life in politics embraced a life in holy orders, either in Anglican holy orders or a few became Catholic priests and so on. I've never in history encountered a journalist who, at the end of a life of journalism, was fit to embrace a life of holy orders. So I'm not going to elongate that point, but I just leave it for your consideration. But journalism is a paradoxical profession because we are called upon to judge people all the time. And that's very corrosive of your soul, to be constantly sitting in judgment of people. But it is our job, we have to do it all the time. We're in judgment of actions, policies, and indeed people. That makes us very censorious towards everyone except ourselves and our colleagues. And in any normal newsroom, the variety of human behaviour that you encounter is so florid that merely going to church is the sort of least eccentric of all the things. And I mean, one very big change in journalism in the 40 years that I've been in it is that it's no longer compulsory to have a drinking problem. And but it was pretty near compulsory when I started out. I'm exaggerating, of course, let me say I'm exaggerating. But it was a very heavy boozing. So really, most journalists are very easygoing about each other and they are in fact very supportive of each other. They're quite competitive, but at the same time they're very supportive. I liken journalism to cricket really. It's a team game played by individuals and it's based on individual performances, but still you're conscious that you're in the team. And if you're in a newsroom with someone else, it's a bit like being in the military with them. It doesn't matter whether they're good or bad, black or white, yellow, brown, Muslim, Christian, anything else. You're in it together. There's a strong corporate friendship. So that's the most long-winded way of saying, no, I haven't really had any trouble.
Look, I think we might wind it up at that point and go into dinner. I'd like to thank Greg for a wonderful talk, for his wisdom and his wit. And just for being here with us in Tasmania, in the Athens of the South. I'd ask His Grace if he would just do the vote of thanks. Please, Your Grace.
I was just thinking, who writes books about God these days? We think, of course, many clerics are prone to do that. Theologians, biblical scholars, as you mentioned. Philosophers will do it. But journalists, I think, it's a bit of a rarity for a journalist to venture into this area. Look, you've ventured into it, I think, as a believer, really, but also you've ventured into it as a journalist. So you bring a unique perspective. I loved reading the book because I felt it was fresh in the way that you went about it. I liked your strong early section about the rationality of Christianity. It was a very firm and I think very convincing presentation. How couldn't you believe in God? And then when you those passages you picked, I would never have picked the story of Jonah or the story of Ruth. Job maybe, perhaps because that is extraordinary insight into just the question of suffering, but you chose the most unusual Old Testament passages to explore and delight in, and it opened my eyes to those passages in a way that I hadn't seen them before. So thank you for that. They gave a great insight. But then when you moved on and started exploring, because of your relationships and working with various politicians, inviting them to share their beliefs, I found that really interesting. I was saying to Greg earlier on today that some politicians whose public stances on various issues, say I would have difficulty with, and yet you could show that they did have the core of their life, a faith. Now, it may not have had expression in all the traditional forms, but there was a faith that nourished, indeed nourished their contribution in public life. Also, who would take positions that I may not agree with, but they were conscientiously taking positions because of a faith that was animating those positions. That was for me, that was very good here. It broadened my mind and my perspective on a number of politicians, and the fact that being involved in public life and having a faith was actually a significant contributor to the attitudes they brought to public life. They weren't in it for themselves, but they were in it for high-minded purposes, and that the faith was something which animated that. And in the end, talking about the monks and talking about the Pentecostals too was again a refreshing reflection on what is happening in Christianity today. So, Greg, I really enjoyed the book, and I found it very refreshing. You took an approach to it different from a cleric, different from a theologian, different from a biblical scholar, and different from a philosopher. But you came at it as a journalist, and I think that gave a uniqueness and a freshness and vitality to the book. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
and thank you for coming down to Tasmania. We actually were on the same plane together today. We're both flying in from Melbourne. He was further down the front of the aircraft. not in the business class, but we weren't able to talk on the plane. But Greg, thank you very much for coming down, for contributing to our reflections tonight. And I do hope many are inspired, if they haven't already, to get your book and to read it, and hopefully find it, as I did, really a refreshing and invigorating presentation of faith and living of faith in the world as it is in 2019. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Thank you. Thanks very much.